One quiet day at the beach, a girl stumbles upon an abandoned car graveyard, where she finds a sight that makes her scream. It's a dead body with a charred and grotesque face. Her brother rushes over, demanding to know what's wrong. Retired Inspector Timpson arrives at the morgue, where he's met with the gruesome sight of the corpse. A man named Nottingham reveals that the woman's throat was fired at, likely with a pistol. Her skull was shattered, and her body was set ablaze inside a sack. When Timpson inquires who's handling the case, Nottingham informs him that it is being managed by two men, Ramsey and Morris. Though Timpson wants to assist, citing his extensive experience as a detective, Nottingham advises him to enjoy his retirement instead. Modern criminals are different, and they're outside his expertise now. Meanwhile, Ramsey suggests that the victim had been intimate before her death, possibly non-consensually, and speculates on the psychological motives behind the murder. Timpson merely dismisses Ramsey's theories as academic nonsense, showing the difference in their approach. Nottingham eventually gives in and allows Timpson to assist as a volunteer, but he makes it clear that Ramsey is in charge. This is enough to make Timpson smile, thrilled by the prospect of working again, though Nottingham repeats that he's just a volunteer. Still, the retired inspector thanks him and promises that he won't take any initiatives or make any decisions. At the police station, the forensics expert presents the evidence to Ramsey. He explains that the yellow pajamas found on the victim are common and inexpensive, easily accessible to anyone. Additionally, grains of rice were discovered in the lining of the sack where the body was found. The expert mentions that he had already informed Timpson of these findings, which visibly frustrates Ramsey, leading him to chastise the expert. Timpson's not in charge of the case, he is. The expert only reasons that the man is following the case, and he's seen the evidence. Timpson also wanted to know about the sack. Later, during a boat ride, Ramsey vents his frustration to Morris, criticizing Timpson's methods and dismissing him as old-fashioned and out of touch. Elsewhere, a woman named Glenda Blythe is in a bedroom, searching for her unmentionables while an older man, Henry, teases her. During a drive, Glenda asks Henry if he knows anyone in the police. He wonders if she needs her permit extended, but it's not that. She was simply asked to visit the police station for questioning about her connection to a woman named Evelyn. Later, while walking together, Henry presses her for more details. He always thought that Evelyn was in love with her. She doesn't think that's the case, though. Evelyn was very introverted, so it's hard to judge her. Henry was under the impression that she lived with Glenda, but she clarifies that Evelyn just asked to stay over at her house a couple of times. Glenda supposes it's because she didn't want to be home alone. One stormy night, Evelyn silently tossed a pair of yellow pajamas out of her bag before removing her top and lying beside Glenda. Silent as she was, Evelyn kept touching her face and embracing her while she rested, but Glenda looked uncomfortable. Eventually, she broke free from the one-sided embrace to stand. She tells Henry that that was the only occasion where she behaved strangely. Meanwhile, Timpson continues his investigation by having a casual talk with the boy who discovered the body. From there, he learns that the woman's body was found in a black Chevrolet, and that a man named Quint is responsible for dumping the cars on the beach. Quint is a dirty, perverse man who lives in a goon cave. His house is filled with depictions of women's bare bodies, from mannequins, statues, posters, and other obscene clippings. He's currently spying on his neighbor while shaking hands with the bishop when Timpson and Ramsey suddenly enter his abode. Quint is very alarmed by their presence, and he regards them with utmost wariness. While it's true he was the one who dumped the cars at the beach, he really knows nothing about the case. Though Timpson maintains his lax and cheery disposition, Ramsey is more aggressive. He goes through Quint's belongings, and when the man nervously reminds him that he needs a warrant to do that, Ramsey grabs his face. He only lets go when Timpson lightheartedly tells him to leave the man since he knows his rights. With that, Ramsey insists that Quint come to the police station for further questioning. Meanwhile, Glenda visits a man named Roy at a glass factory. They start chatting in a locker room, but Roy initiates a kiss. Though Glenda initially resists out of fear of someone walking in on them, she eventually gives in. After their tryst, Roy mentions seeing her in Henry's Jaguar, and that she should stop seeing him. Displeased, Glenda walks out on him, spurring Roy to chase her and plead for forgiveness. He'll never mention Henry again. Besides, he introduced her to Antonio, remember? Still, Glenda snaps at him to leave her alone, which he does not do. Afterward, Glenda is seen spending time with Roy's Italian friend, Antonio. Though Antonio's the jealous and more uptight sort, the two of them enjoy each other's company. At the police station, Ramsey enters to find Quint having his thumbprint taken as part of the booking process. Morris informs Ramsey about the bullet found at the crime scene. It is a Colt 38, a military issue, American-made, and a recent model. Timpson visits a rice packaging plant to investigate the rice found in the sack. He questions the plant's manager about the type of rice and the sack's material. The manager reveals that the rice is from Asia. It's relatively uncommon, and the sack's material is outdated as their plant now uses plastic sacks. While Ramsey waits at a restaurant for Timpson, he is served by Antonio, who he happens to be friends with. When Timpson arrives, they discuss the details of the investigation. Ramsey has all kinds of ideas about the kind of people the perps might be, but Timpson stresses that the crime cannot be solved without identifying the victim. No problem, because Ramsey has a plan, but he needs permission from the church and further government approval. He then brings up the medical reports, indicating that the woman had an intimate encounter before her death. That means little to Timpson though, so Ramsey stresses that the results show there were at least 2 sadistic men involved. They killed for the sake of it, and he wouldn't be shocked if they were hopped off on God knows what. Timpson disagrees, saying that the killer killed the victim because they were afraid. The victim could have known the killer personally. Hell, the perp could be a woman for all they know. After lunch, Timpson visits the restaurant owner to inquire about the rice used in his meal, which matches the rice found in the sack. The owner consults his staff and learns that this type of rice is typically found in Arab or Chinese restaurants. Back to Glenda's life, she and Antonio go on a date. She even takes him to the ship she waitresses for, and Antonio gets annoyed by all the men hungrily staring at her. Later, they embrace outside the Sydney Opera House where he tells her he wants to get married. In the morgue, Timpson asks about the preservation of the body, and is informed that it can be preserved for public viewing, which might aid in its identification and further the investigation. Timpson then examines the yellow pajamas and discovers a tag. He traces the tag to a laundromat, where he inquires about the clothes. The owner's wife recalls that a woman had recently picked up a pair of yellow pajamas, and she was accompanied by a large man who lives in New Center. Eventually, Ramsey's plan comes to fruition, and it's to display the pajama girl's corpse to the public. It's a divisive sight. Many are repulsed and disturbed by the body and the fact that it's being displayed. But at the same time, many others are curious, and they even try to get a closer look. After the exhibit, people start flooding the station, thinking that the victim's body is a friend or a relative of theirs. Among them is a woman named Patricia, who convinces Ramsey that the body is her daughter's by providing very specific details about it. As for Glenda, she's now married to Antonio, but that doesn't stop her from meeting with Henry. He shares some stories about his travels around Europe, including a visit to Glenda's hometown. Henry claims to have met an escort there, who shares Glenda's face and name. The amusement drains from the woman's face as she slaps him before leaving the car. Henry incessantly apologizes while driving alongside her, but Glenda remains silent as she weeps. Following this, Glenda finds herself in bed with Roy. He laughs at the thought of not seeing Glenda again just because she's married to Antonio. To Roy, the world is full of crap. Even honest people will take advantage of you. After her tryst with Roy, Glenda comes home to find Antonio waiting for her. The man is on edge as he demands to know where she's been, and a stone-faced Glenda explains that she worked an additional shift for another boat. Antonio only eases up when she mentions seeing Roy with a woman there, and he jokes that the woman must be an escort. Returning to the case, Timpson visits Patricia's very eccentric husband, who greets him while in a bathtub. He married Patricia for residency, and he knows for a fact that the murdered woman is not their daughter, Anna, for Anna is currently living in Paris. Patricia's made a sport of claiming dead bodies to be her daughters, so she can claim her life insurance of $100,000. One time, she even flew to Hong Kong after a plane crash to try her fraud there. Back in Quint's neighborhood, Ramsey and his partner question Quint's neighbor about her relationship with the man. When she denies knowing him, they accuse her of visiting him at night, but the woman only says it's none of their business. Before they leave, the woman's daughter approaches Ramsey to hand him the watch that creepy Quint had given her mother. The detectives line the watch against the corpse's wrist, and when they see it's a perfect fit, they become even more convinced that Quint is involved in the murder. Morris, Ramsey, and the other officers brutally beat Quint to force a confession out of him. Despite their efforts, Quint adamantly denies killing the woman. Yes, he stole the watch after discovering her body, but he really didn't do anything. Unfortunately for Quint, Ramsey's already convinced of his guilt, and thanks to the man's sordid past, he's sure that many women would testify against his depravity. Despite lacking any strong and conclusive evidence, Ramsey calls Nottingham to announce Quint's arrest, thus bringing a close to the pajama girl case. Timpson later confronts Ramsey, protesting against Quint's arrest. He accuses Ramsey of being in a hurry to apprehend the wrong man just to look good for the elections. To support his claim, he presents the insurance document for Patricia's daughter, but Ramsey doesn't care. The case is closed, and he's off to his holiday. Meanwhile, Henry makes a call to Glenda from a payphone, telling her about a gynecologist friend she can consult. She then meets Roy at the beach, where she reveals she's pregnant, and that Antonio left her after a heated argument. Roy is suspicious of the child's paternity, and asks if Glenda's considering getting rid of the baby. She refuses to do so, but Glenda knows that raising a fatherless child would be difficult. With that, Roy offers to mediate a meeting between her and Antonio. Glenda and Antonio meet outside the Sydney Opera House, where she discloses her pregnancy. Frustrated, Antonio accuses her of seeking money, but Glenda insists she only wants to inform him. He harshly rebukes her and demands she leave. Without a word, Glenda walks away and weeps in silence. But Antonio soon approaches her with an ice cream cone, and they reconcile with an embrace. Despite the lack of support, Timpson continued on with his own investigation until he eventually gathered enough information. One night, he speaks into a recorder and addresses Morris. He claims that he is going to meet the murderer of Glenda Blythe, the woman in the yellow pajamas. Timpson's aware that his life is in danger, but he knows what happened to Glenda. As such, he leaves this taped recording behind, and he gives it to his neighbor before heading to a warehouse. While Timpson is searching through the parking lot, a car suddenly strikes him from the side, causing him to fall. The impact is fatal, and Timpson dies on the ground. Timpson's death prompts the reopening of the investigation, as it is suspected his murder is linked to his ongoing pursuit of the truth. The whole thing is a mess for Ramsey and the other higher-ups, especially with elections approaching, but they opt to double down on Quint until they find the true suspect. Quint's neighbor tries to contact Morris to hand over the tape, while Ramsey searches Timpson's apartment for clues, but he only finds a small white envelope containing rice. Returning to Glenda's life, the woman is struck with grief. A nun consoles the devastated woman as she mourns the death of her baby boy. An equally heartbroken Antonio waits near the exit, and when Glenda emerges, he gives her flowers, and they leave the hospital together. After some time, Glenda accompanies Henry to an upscale restaurant. As they walk toward their table, the older, extravagantly dressed guests stare at Glenda with disdain, making it clear that she doesn't belong in the establishment. Henry tells her not to worry, as she's the youngest and prettiest girl who ever entered that tomb. More seriously now, he asks Glenda why can't she ever be happy, but she doesn't know the answer to that. She then changes the subject to Evelyn, who recently sent her a gift from Los Angeles. They're the yellow pajamas Evelyn wore when she stayed the night. After dinner, Henry drops Glenda off near the apartment she shares with Antonio. He implores her to think about his offer, and Glenda says she will. During dinner, Antonio eats sloppily as he talks to Glenda about getting an expensive angel for their son's grave, but she doesn't say anything as she walks to their bedroom. While Antonio drones about her picking up a job as a cleaning lady, Glenda gazes out at the bright, colorful lights of Sydney. Come next day, a scorned Roy and Antonio meet up to talk about Glenda, who had run away. She took all her belongings, and even Roy's camper, which she said she needed to move some furniture. Roy claims that she went to see Henry in Albury, so they quickly get a move on to catch up to her. During their car ride, Roy fans the flames in Antonio's heart, saying that he warned him against Glenda. He acts concerned about Antonio, like he never delighted in Glenda cheating on his friend to begin with. His instigation works as Antonio tearfully cusses Glenda out. He wonders if they should report her to the police, but Roy reminds him they're immigrants. Besides, he knows women like Glenda. To him, they're just like dogs. You need to give them a good slap or beating to get anything. Roy proceeds to call Glenda vulgar names, claiming that she's been sleeping with everyone, but this makes Antonio mad. He accuses Roy of sleeping with her, but Roy manages to dodge the accusation by reminding him of their strong friendship. As for Glenda, she goes to a phone booth and cheerily calls Henry's home. She surprises him by saying she's nearby and asks if she can visit, referencing his previous offers. However, Henry is hosting a party and has company. He refuses, telling her it's a bad time, and advises her to return to Sydney and be with her husband. Realizing that Henry never had genuine intentions, Glenda ends the call. She's heartbroken as she enters a diner, where a large man keeps shooting her suggestive looks. The man soon approaches her, inviting her to join him and his two companions. When he tries to persuade her, Glenda interrupts and names her price, $100. Shocked, the man attempts to haggle as the usual price is $20. Glenda remains firm, stating the price covers him and his two companions. The man reluctantly agrees. The four of them head to Glenda's motel room, where the blank-faced woman allows the men to have their way with her. Among them is the large man's younger nephew, who guiltily watches as Glenda tears up in silence. That night, Roy and Antonio locate Roy's camper. Before getting out of the car, Roy convinces Antonio to beat Glenda into submission. When Antonio hesitates, Roy offers to do it himself, spurring Antonio to step up. He then approaches the camper, seeing Glenda outside, smoking a cigarette and wearing yellow pajamas. They exchange glances before Antonio enters the camper, with Glenda following shortly after. Inside, Antonio starts packing Glenda's belongings, intending to take her back to Sydney. However, Glenda stops him, telling him to give up. She says she doesn't want to wash dishes her entire life, calling him a failure, and accusing him of trying to drag her down to his miserable existence. Her insults push Antonio over the edge, leading him to slap her. Antonio continues to beat Glenda while packing her bags. She tries to escape and grab a hidden gun, but Antonio, in his rage, pins her down. Outside, Roy waits in the car when the sharp crack of a gunshot suddenly pierces the air. He rushes toward the camper and sees Glenda stumbling out before collapsing to the ground. Roy runs to her side, discovering a bloody gunshot wound on her neck. Panicking, Roy enters the camper to find a distraught Antonio, who denies killing Glenda, insisting she fired the shot herself. He urges his friend to flee, but Antonio is so overwhelmed that he merely wets himself before snapping out of it. In the present, Timpson's neighbor finally reaches Inspector Morris just as the man is stepping into his car. She hands him the tape Timpson left, along with another item. This then leads to Roy being taken to the police station, where Ramsey awaits. The officers beat Roy while Timpson's tape plays ominously in the background. Ramsey then reveals the other item Timpson left behind, the carjack used to bludgeon Glenda to death, still stained with blood. According to the tape, Antonio shot his wife, but she wasn't wounded fatally. On the night of the murder, Roy places Glenda's body in a sack and hauls it to the trunk of the car. As Antonio drives the camper back to Sydney, Roy vows to take care of the body. When he tries to close the trunk, the lid begins to descend but suddenly stops and slowly rises back up. Glenda's hand, still hanging outside, blocks the lid from closing. As the trunk fully reopens, Roy realizes that Glenda is still alive, barely clinging to life. Without hesitation, Roy grabs the carjack and delivers the fatal blow, ending her life. He then drives to the beach, sets the sack ablaze, and leaves her body behind. In the aftermath of Roy's arrest, Antonio calls Ramsey, revealing his location and asking the detective to promise to come alone. At the cemetery, Antonio waits at his child's gravestone, placing flowers on it. Ramsey arrives, and they exchange a few tense words. Suddenly, several policemen appear around the cemetery from different vantage points. Antonio is rattled and begins to shout at Ramsey, vehemently denying any wrongdoing and accusing the police of targeting him because he's an immigrant without wealth, making him an easy scapegoat. Ramsey tries to calm Antonio down, urging him to talk it out, but Antonio panics and flees. Ramsey and the other officers give chase. As Antonio tries to escape, he runs into the street and is struck by a bus. The driver and passengers, a high school marching band, and their teachers rush out to check on him. One of the adults checks his pulse as the concerned students look on, distraught. Slowly, Antonio opens his eyes, but there's barely any life to them. The students are made to return to the bus, leaving Antonio to Ramsey and the other officers as they finally close the case.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.